The story begins by introducing us to this boy, who is our protagonist. The boy had noticed that, had stopped, except for him, and suddenly this girl appears, confirming that, in fact, the shock on their parents, but contrary to what we all thought, they were not disappointed, because, unlike others, the boy's parents were good people and simply told him to concentrate on his studies. Although, of course, the church hid the fact that he had trained for over 1,000 years. After talking for a while with his parents, the protagonist returned to his room, where he found one of his creations, the spear that he had created in his time as a blacksmith, which now seemed to be registered in his system with all the specifications that it had, and he was able to discover how a normal person was capable of facing even a level 5 monster. Furthermore, people at level 7 were already considered rare soldiers. Moreover, from level 10 onward, they could take classes such as archers, among others. And when they reach level 50, they are considered the strongest and can advance to the second class, while advancement to the third class is possible, up to level 100. From that point on, you are considered a precious national resource. But anyway, once the protagonist investigated all of this, he decided to take a break. Earth's time had stopped for everyone but him, revealing that she was the emissary. Although as he did so, he began to remember all the moments he had spent together with Lita. But then, another angel appeared. Her name was Earth, or so it said, and she had been sent to teach the boy everything he needed to know about another world, and, of course, some mana fundamentals. This had been at Lista's request, who was worried about the boy. However, she hadn't been able to return, as the higher-ups were concerned about a human and an angel getting too close. But the way the fairy would help him develop his mana was solely by being near him. Since she was a divine being, her mere presence would help him accumulate mana from the environment, and they're asking why the protagonist didn't gather mana while he was with Lita. Remember that it was because time was stopped. On the other hand, Earth informs him that the time he will be by her side will be exactly 1 year, and the next day, the protagonist decides to return to university as normal, obviously accompanied by the angel, who was not visible to anyone, another person, and he noticed how several squads of soldiers had been deployed throughout the city, although he wasn't, of God, meaning an angel. Her name was Lita, and she told him that the reason she had visited was he wasn't sure that would be effective against the beasts that were about to appear, and once the good Yile was inside the field and realized his stealth ability was still active, making his presence was extremely difficult for his companions to detect. While this wasn't entirely a bad thing, it allowed him to find his classmates' conversations without being noticed, and he overheard how, in the other world, a student from his university had distinguished herself with her exceptional mana control, becoming known as the Empress. Because of this, everyone was eager to learn her identity in this world. Furthermore, he also overheard the students. They were waiting for dungeons to appear so they could level up. The angel quickly explains to him that these dungeons were a kind of trap created by the gods, where various monsters were trapped in a small area, and where humans could enter and exit at will, and of course, defeat them to increase their level. However, they had to eliminate the monsters within a time limit, because if they didn't, the monsters would be released, and could inform him that he had been left behind. He was shocked because he didn't quite understand what was happening. So, attack. Following this, as the class continued, the angel continued to give him some explanations about how, to learn how to manage his mana, he needed to start eliminating monsters, so his level would begin to increase. The protagonist was somewhat worried about this, but the girl told him not to worry because, despite not possessing mana, his physically trained body from years of work could help him defeat even level 25 monsters, and he could test his abilities at that very moment, as the field was being attacked by a huge swarm of insect-like monsters, and now humanity would have to survive on its own. Immediately, the rest of the students fell into a panic. This, because they didn't have the same abilities as in the previous world, they knew they would have to face the monsters. It meant putting his life and everyone else's lives at risk. Of all the people there, the only one who stayed behind to face them, as we already know, who it was, our protagonist, the only person without mana in the entire world. The angel explained that those monsters wouldn't cause too many difficulties, since apparently they were only level 20, and in his current state, he would be able to. Lita explained that all humans had been sent to another dimension, with the exception of him. This was, defeat even level 25 creatures, or at least that's what the angel believed, who, after observing the movements of the angel, The protagonist realized that Lita had lied to him, that he was already a monster, and so he prepared himself by acquiring a homemade weapon. The boy began his battle against the monsters, and naturally, he did so while wearing a mask to protect his identity. After defeating several of them, his stats began to evolve at an incredible rate. He had immediately managed to reach level 3, but the boy wasn't satisfied and continued to massacre each and every monster that crossed his path. The guy was on a rampage, finally able to make use of everything he had learned over the last 1,000 years. Years passed, yet he still couldn't fully trust himself because the creature seemed limitless, and more kept arriving until, in the end, one managed to reach him with its stinger. But don't worry, the boy's skin was so tough that it was the sting that ended up breaking in two. The angel, who was watching everything from afar, couldn't believe it. That boy's body had surpassed human limitations. So many years of training had finally paid off. But anyway, the protagonist continued. Because the Earth was undergoing a cataclysm, and of course, she explained in greater detail what this meant, facing the creatures until this mysterious girl appeared, who, it seemed, was the Empress of, which everyone was talking about, showcasing the rumors surrounding her, as she was an extraordinarily powerful human which could create lightning bolts to attack. And so, with the help of this new girl, the protagonist was finally able to get rid of all the pack of monsters and, of course, thanks to this, he was able to reach level 7. When the military arrived on the AM scene, they couldn't believe it. Who were these people who had finished off that group of insects? What level were they? But the protagonist wasn't too concerned about that. He was more focused on extracting all the cores from the creatures. That he had defeated it, because the angel had explained that, after defeating the beasts, that part was the most valuable, and he could earn a lot of money from it. After the protagonist finished gathering all the beast cores that he had defeated, he quickly wanted to leave, although he was stopped by the military, who wanted to know the identity of that boy. However, the girl from before ended up helping him so he could leave peacefully, and it turns out that the Earth is leveling up, having finally reached its peak potential. Of course, that wouldn't be a problem, since thanks to his stealth skill, all the people at the scene, they lost sight of me, and after that, I found myself in a quieter place, surrounded by all the remains the boy had gathered. He wanted to create some kind of armor, so the angel ended up explaining how he should forge the armor and what to do in order to. There were 2 ways to do that. The first was to forge the tools using the parts of the monsters, which the protagonist ended up doing easily, obtaining several pieces for his armor, and the second way was to use his own humanity to shape the core obtained from the monsters, which, judging by the results, the birth area, into a weapon far superior to the others. However, because the boy possessed only a meager amount of mana, that goal was beyond his reach. Still, the boy decided to try, and despite what Angel had believed, he came very close to assembling a scythe using the matrix core, thanks to his great mental strength. Unfortunately, his mana was too scarce, and he couldn't quite achieve it. Luckily, the angel ultimately decided to lend him a hand, providing the missing mana, which means that the mana, which had been stored for so long, will finally be released. But the release of this said mana, and he managed to obtain what he sought. He now possessed a very powerful weapon, and after resting for a while, staying home and listening to the news, he continued to hunt monsters to level up. Even as he did so, he had warned him that he had detected the presence of several monsters approaching, and he didn't seem concerned. Ordinary. But instead, more than 70 wolves and wild dogs, led by a level 35 diamond wolf. The protagonist quickly asked him what was going on, questioning whether he hadn't said that in the early days of the cataclysm, only level 5 monsters would appear, but the angel told him that wasn't important anymore. The important thing was to stop the beasts before they caused a massacre in the city, and on the way, the girl. He explained that perhaps all of this was happening because, while the humans had been taken to another world, not only the protagonist had been trapped in those lands, but also the animals, and perhaps that was the reason the monsters from Earth were much stronger than those from other worlds. They had barely arrived at the location of the beasts when this mana release will also bring with it the awakening of very powerful monsters, ones that cannot be defeated by human weapons. He asked for her help, explaining that right now, the heavens were doing everything possible to restore balance to the world, but for the moment, they needed his help to protect the people who weren't prepared to defend themselves. Naturally, if he did so, he would be compensated accordingly. Obviously, the protagonist accepted, not only for the reward, but also to protect all the people in the city. So, in an epic scene, the boy went on the offensive against the monsters, striking, beginning the battle. You have obtained 12,900 experience points. You have reached level 9. Although, of course, he shouldn't only finish off the wolves, but also protect all the people who were in that place. And in the end, the boy, after saving several people, he managed to level up to 10, and, of course, now he could choose a class. However, one of the wolves managed to call for more reinforcements, and now there he was, completely surrounded, and he could only continue fighting. He didn't have time to think about anything else. Luckily, thanks to his swift movements, he was eventually able to finish off most of the beasts, until one of the wolves took a civilian hostage, holding him against the doors. Therefore, if humans were left as they were, humanity would probably end up being exterminated. It was for this reason. However, due to his stealth, in a split second he managed to take out the wolf with his weapon, although that was part of the wolf's plans. Beasts, who were waiting for the moment she would leave herself vulnerable to attack. But then, the protagonist finished them off, the remaining wolves using only his fists, since his true weapon was his body. But anyway, once he finished his task, the military showed up and quickly tried to persuade him to join the army. Obviously, the protagonist refused, since he only wanted to work independently. Although, of course, he ended up profiting from the situation and sold them the wolves' corpses. Naturally, he kept the beasts' cores and obtained a hefty sum of money. But anyway, once he withdrew from the area, he now had to choose which class he belonged to, because, as we recall, he had reached level 10, and a menu appeared before him displaying all the options available to him. Ultimately, he ended up choosing the Lancer class, since, according to the advice he received, that class could help him increase his skills with the spear even further. Although, of course, he told him not to worry too much about the lesson, because upon reaching a higher, there was no one on his university campus, so he decides to return home. However, no matter how much the boy, this is why the god of that angel had created a kind of avatar system for humans, with the intention of level, he could even obtain more classes. What he didn't expect was that when he chose the Lancer class, right in front of him, a specialized class appeared, the blurry Lancer class. Obviously, he ended up choosing it since very few people were capable of unlocking customized classes. Now he would become a Lancer who fights in the shadows, and of course, after obtaining a class, all of his stats increased. The downside to this was that, after examining his growth rate, he was told that he wouldn't gain much mana, regardless of how much he leveled up. In other words, he had to continue fighting physically, something like Rock Lee. Even so, the protagonist didn't have time to rest because he had to continue hunting the monsters that had lost their balance, and, of course, while searching for them, Angel revealed to him that not only he had been contacted by the gods to restore the balance, but also other people with outstanding abilities. Outstanding. And among them, of course, the Empress. Something that greatly excited the boy, as he was anxious to see her again. Let's see, but before that, he had to face his next opponent, a gray bear of an unknown level. In the send them to another world so that humans could learn to use mana in a different environment, as they would at least have. Previous chapter, we were able to observe how this enormous bear had appeared in the city. Faced with such a situation, the boy, he was excited and simultaneously a little surprised, as he had expected the government to launch rockets, but they didn't. That's how it happened. The angel quickly tells him to look towards the bear, which was currently destroying everything in its path. The soldiers who were in that location weren't going to wait for the bear to destroy everything. So one of the soldiers gives the order to fire at it. They obey the order and begin shooting relentlessly, but we can see how absolutely nothing affects the bear. The soldiers were scared to death, as they had noticed that nothing worked against him, as he thought. So, how were they supposed to deal with a monster like that on the 4th day of the cataclysm? The angel who was with the protagonist seemed a little disappointed because, in her opinion, human architecture was weaker than she thought, considering they couldn't even withstand an attack from a Class 2 monster. The protagonist quickly puts on his mask, saying, "So it looks like the monster is having a lot of fun," and striking an epic pose, the bare minimum to fight against monsters, because a monster composed of high-ranking energy could not. The protagonist prepares to attack, saying, so now he's ready, and because he had been carefully timing his powers, skills increased by 10%, both the stealth skill and the spear skill, and with a murderous glint in his eyes, he says that the only time stealth truly shines is when the enemy is struck first. The protagonist quickly launches himself towards the bear to attack. The angel, who was observing everything, was a little worried because the protagonist launched himself headfirst towards the monster, because, as our protagonist has the stealth ability, it tells him that the Bear won't be able to sense him until he makes contact, so he thinks to himself, I'll trust in my ability to conceal my presence, even in the face of gods. Ignoring all words, the protagonist launches his attack, severely damaging the bear. The soldiers, who were watching all of this unfold, were shocked by the sudden attack and realized that the one who did it was our protagonist. We see him once again, face to face with the bear. The boy, realizing that the monster wasn't defeated with a single blow, tells the others that if they want to continue living, they should run. But be killed, not even by a nuclear missile. However, the protagonist asks what about himself and why he hadn't. They can also stay if they want to. Seeing that the monster was still standing, the citizens decide to leave. Leaving everything in our protagonist's hands, the bear notices someone is above him, and when he realizes that the one above him is our protagonist, and the bear decides to attack. However, the protagonist is quickly able to dodge the attack, and, with his spear, manages to wound him again. Now, the bear was angrier than ever. But thanks to the protagonist's skill, the monster loses sight of him. Seeing that the monster lost sight of him, and that this is his opportunity to attack, the protagonist becomes thoughtful, and remembers that when he was training with Lita, it was said that by concentrating all of his weight on a single point, his attack would become more powerful. The boy, remembering this, he decides to do what Lita had taught him, which is to concentrate all of his weight onto a single point, and putting into practice what Lita had told him, he launches himself against the beast once more, finally managing to defeat the bear once and for all. You have gained 12,900 experience points, and because he defeated the beast, the boy is now level 23 and has gained 8 points. Been sent to another world like everyone else, to which the girl replies that, due to an ability he possessed called of strength and 7 of dexterity, as well as HP and mana. Another thing is that the system also allowed him to obtain the Great Brown Bear's records, including the 1-hit, 1-kill title, had also increased the critical hit chance by 10%. After this, the protagonist is surprised that his spear withstood the fight, and thinks it's great, since he will be able to fight many more monsters, and as expected, the boy didn't want to leave empty-handed, so he starts looking for the fragments left by the monsters. While the boy was looking for the fragments, he tells the angel that he obtained the critical hit skill, and she responds that, in fact, that skill is quite good, since works perfectly with his stealth ability, and also informs him that everything the boy does, from fighting monsters to interacting with others, will significantly influence the skill's development and his own personal growth. So the angel hoped that the boy would continue to accomplish great things, and, of course, that he would seize the opportunity to learn even more skills. Then we observe a car suddenly arriving, and some kids emerge, asking, Stealth, his god was unable to send him to the other world, and now it was too late, because the portal had already been where the monsters were. Apparently, they intended to deal with the bear, since they were also ability skills. However, upon arriving, he's quite surprised because the soldiers inform him that the monster had already been defeated. When the boys turn to look, they notice someone next to the bear, and it's none other than the masked boy, our protagonist, who is momentarily alarmed because he thought the boy had seen him, even with his stealth ability active, but the angel tells him that, to be exact, he was looking at the corpse of the bear and, by chance, must have seen our protagonist's mask, since he was standing right next to the body. The boy who had arrived was hesitant, as he still couldn't believe that our protagonist had killed the bear all by himself, being the 4th day of the cataclysm, apparently because very strong monsters were going to appear on the 4th day. And as the protagonist defeated it all alone, and he couldn't believe it, but in the end, they praised him for his great strength, since he was only able to deal with the bear, and they asked if he happened to find a hidden dungeon or anything like that, completely sealed off. Furthermore, the angel informs him that humanity will return in 10 years. Unfortunately, the protagonist would have to. Even though they kept asking questions, the boy didn't answer them, which made them quite angry. While our protagonist was rummaging around when he noticed someone approaching him, a boy who wanted to offer his hand. But our protagonist didn't make a move. The boy didn't approach him to express gratitude or anything of the sort, but rather to tell him to remember his name, because he would soon make sure to surpass him, to which the protagonist replies that if he gets ahead of him, what would he do? The boy responds that no matter what, one day he will be the strongest of them all, declaring our protagonist as his rival. Later, we see the boy in possession of the bear's pelt, because, when it seems there were no magic stones inside the monster, However, according to the boy, the body is quite usable and extremely resistant, even deflecting bullets. At that moment, a soldier approaches him, saying he has an offer to make. Our protagonist assumed the soldier was talking about the bear's hide, but the soldier clarifies that no, he was referring to a strange app that, if downloaded, would show the locations of. He had to stay on Earth for all that time, unable to learn how to use mana, so the girl advised him other monsters on his map, as this would greatly aid him in his career. The protagonist agrees, but only if that information is not. It was highly confidential, and he asked if it was alright for him to share that information, to which the lieutenant replies that it is for the good of the citizens, saying, so, if this could help reduce, since it would lead to fewer monsters, there was no problem sharing the information. With that said, the protagonist, without further delay, he asks his questions and decides to leave the place. The soldier asks his lieutenant if it's alright to let him go like that, since they could try to force him to cooperate with them using any method possible, to which the lieutenant responds, asking if he believes that a skill user like him, who managed to defeat a Class 2 monster with just 3 hits, wasn't going to be affected by anything. He mentioned that he had seen ability users leading entire nations in the other world, and monsters destroying those very nations. Thus, he reaffirmed that he was sure our protagonist would become stronger, and if they tried to restrict his actions, he might turn against them, something they obviously didn't want. Moving on to our protagonist's side, the angel had overheard the conversation between the soldier and the lieutenant, remarking that the lieutenant was that during all that time he should train his physique to such an extreme level that he wouldn't need mana to survive. And he wouldn't. The angel had overheard the conversation that the soldier had with the lieutenant and commented that the lieutenant was very smart and that he would probably live a long time, since he was able to recognize our protagonist's potential, but the boy doesn't think so. Like this, he says that the lieutenant is overestimating what he is capable of, but the angel disagrees and says, don't underestimate what he is capable of, thinking that if the military were to try and force him to cooperate, he would destroy the entire army simply for the sake of not following orders. Furthermore, the military does not have the means to control him, implying that the lieutenant did his best to remain on good terms with him and create media later. All while Erta looks at her phone, thinking about our protagonist. He doesn't understand how strong he is or how much he's worth in that world. As she's pondering this, the boy interrupts her, noticing that 3 new monsters have appeared. New monsters. The boy asks Erta what they should do, and she responds with a smile, telling him there's no reason to worry. There is no reason to worry, since they are going to defeat the 3 monsters. Hearing this, we can see how the boy, he has no other choice but to accept, since that was his last resort. And so, this manga begins. And if you are interested in the story, he is excited because he will be able to practice his skills again. Afterwards, we see how the boy was able to defeat the 3 troublesome monsters. Intrigued, the boy wondered how it was possible that after defeating those 3 monsters, he was still only at level 24, complaining that he had only managed to level up once, to which Hertha explains the reason, revealing that the 3 monsters the protagonist had faced were weaker than the big bad wolf and the brown bear, explaining that our protagonist's unique class requires him to gain more combat experience, adding that if the boy were like any other human, he would have easily leveled up to. The boy remembers that at least they received something in return, because they sold everything related to the bear to the military, and thanks to that, they obtained a lot of money. So much so that our protagonist was thinking of buying a property, but Elta interrupts him, saying that it is not very smart to spend the money so quickly, since they can be traced, saying that if the boy wants to spend money, he would help him only for this one occasion, adding that he waited at the bus stop. It never arrived, so he decides to walk home instead. But what he didn't, of this boy. Stick around, because today, I'm summarizing everything for you. The others are returnees. After this, they show us about 5. Would erase the officer's memories the next morning, and Lai was surprised by what was happening. Seeing it on his system, the system displays a new skill that appears with the following message, that the broken connection to the other world had been restored, explaining that from that moment on, the boy is able to go physically to the other world, where he was once summoned, and, likewise, complete missions so that the world receives the adequate compensation. However, let's remember that the boy was never summoned to any world, leading him to think that if that's the case, then he would be alone again. Later, we see Hele demanding an explanation from Erda, so appeared in the system, which explained that because the monsters on Earth were becoming too strong, it had been contemplating the situation and reached a conclusion to send all humans to the other world so that they could gain more experience. The protagonist isn't convinced by this idea, as he doesn't want to be left alone again. But Hertha responds that he was already alone from the beginning, so what difference would it make to him? Years later, after humanity had been transported to another world, even though time was standing still, the boy responds that his concern isn't so much traveling to the other world, but rather that his mother is surely going to ask him the reason. Which, because he didn't go to the other world, she tells him that all she had to do was tell him there was nothing to learn there. But the protagonist, he flatly refuses, because he didn't want to act like a high school student going through puberty. The angel tells Ile that she truly regrets his circumstances, but she couldn't do anything, since it was not she who decided that destiny for him. The protagonist tells her that he already knows, and says, "So, I guess that meant that he couldn't go to the other world," but Herta replies that it isn't impossible, as there is a way, that's because if the boy were to become a higher being, he wouldn't just be able to travel to the other world, but he could even go to the heavens, implying that he would be on the same level as them, the angels. The boy is taken aback by the information, and she explains that if he becomes a higher being, there's a chance that he could see Lita again. Erta, while looking at the protagonist, thinks that the more she observes him, it's almost as if they're in a long-distance relationship. See how the protagonist, throughout that time, had focused on strengthening his body in the gym, while the rest long distance, and if that were the case, he would essentially be acting as a messenger of love. It's all. Enraged, she tells the boy to train harder so he can become a greater being and journey to the other realm. The boy, at that very moment, asks her how long it will take, to which she replies that it should be less than a millennium. He leaves, quite happy, saying that he supposes he has to wait. Later, we can see the boy's family gathered, listening to the news, which announces that, from that very instant, a state of emergency under martial law has been declared throughout the entire country. The boy couldn't believe what I had heard, that a state of emergency under martial law would entail many things, including the closure of all schools. The boy's mother says that, apparently, this isn't just happening in their country, but worldwide, saying, so they have no choice, since the monsters are dangerous. Meanwhile, the protagonist thinks, it seems that even the government is acknowledging that they are helpless without changes. Then he goes on to tell them, other people were learning how to use mana, while all the protagonist could do was work on his physical strength. To his parents that they should go to the other world. But the boy's father asks him what the point is in going there, since he had been there for 10 years and couldn't even achieve his second-class advancement. But the boy, worried, he tells him that more monsters will start appearing from that moment onward, and that he needs to become much stronger. Saying that, at the very least, it should be safer to go to the other world than to remain on Earth. To which his father, with a serious expression, tells him that he understands what he means, and that if that is what he truly thinks, then they will see each other again soon, telling him to never give up and to always try his best until the very end. Finally, and after this, the boy's father immediately passes away and goes to the other world, leaving behind the boy and his mother. Speechless, a few minutes later the boy was eating with his mother and complimented her because, apparently, his mother's food was very delicious. The protagonist was about to take another spoonful when he stopped because his mother was asking him if he was the person who hunts monsters while wearing a mask. The protagonist, becoming nervous, the angel, throughout that time, had continued to accompany him and was quite surprised to see the boy's determination. Asks her how she knew that, to which his mother replies by asking if he really thought she wouldn't be able to figure it out. He admitted that he was quite surprised when he saw him on TV, recognizing him even with a mask and different clothes. She could tell it was him. After they talked for a bit and parted on good terms, later the mother of our boy decides to leave, but not before telling him to always be careful. The protagonist tells him to take care of himself as well, much in the other world. After that, the boy was washing the dishes when Herta approaches him to tell him that she headed to the skies to obtain more quest rewards. After telling him that, Herta proceeds to leave, and she was puzzled because the protagonist had asked her to bring him ice cream on her way. We then see the boy, who shows that the night before, he had used all his money to buy a storage unit, saying, so, from that moment on, this would be his workshop. And even though the boy didn't have everything he needed, the raw bones would spoil if he didn't take care of them quickly, and he was also hoping to use some. That, despite being alone, he had only focused on training. The protagonist, for his part, had also begun to meddle, but since he didn't have any materials, he figured that should be enough for the bones. Then, the Prota told himself that taking care of his body and toughening it up seemed to take too long, and at this rate, He wondered how long it would really take to finish creating the equipment, at which point Erta suddenly appeared, saying that he could take care of it using magic. Erta surprised the protagonist, as he had returned much too quickly, and, while he was asking if he had bought the ice cream, we can see how surprised he is to see that Erta was increasing in size. The protagonist asks him if he also knows how to use gigantification magic, to which she replies that she was only using reduction magic the entire time. Then Erta proceeds to tell the boy to please give her his hand so she can give him his reward. The protagonist accepts without a problem, while thinking that Erta's hand was cold but soft, when suddenly the system displays something saying, Sky Search 001, Green Agent completed. It also shows him that all of his stats have increased by 1%, and that the boy has been grow fond of the angel, since he was the only person he could talk to, and who also prepared food for him, the most successful among all the mission participants, and will receive additional rewards. And lastly, it concludes, telling the boy that he had obtained the eternal flame. The protagonist then asks Herta what the deal was with that flame, eternal, to which she happily tells him to just look behind him. When he turns around, he notices that the furnace was lit, and he wondered when that fire had started, since he hadn't even lit it, but he was even more surprised when he sees a flame coming out of the oven, with Herta telling him that it is a flame that continuously grows without going out, this being the eternal flame. In the previous video, we were able to observe how Herta had given him the eternal flame. After giving her the reward, he informs her that he has more good news, telling her that the heavens have bestowed upon him another quest, that is, a new mission. She explains that, since the boy can no longer travel to another world from this point forward, the gods have tasked him with creating a dungeon on Earth. The boy was at a loss for what to say, as he felt uncertain and questioned why they would choose him. Then he tells, delicious meals daily. Then, the protagonist, now that he had built a solid physical foundation over the last 5, Erta, that dungeons are amazing, but he unfortunately doesn't believe he's capable of completing such a mission, that he believes he can't do it, but Berta tells him that the heavens have declared him specifically for this reason. He had to help create that mission for that reason, but the reluctant protagonist tells her that he doesn't want to because he was previously told that 10 years was all that was needed, but it took a millennium, leading him to say, so that's what was supposed to. The monsters during the early stages of the Great Cataclysm were supposed to be weak, but they weren't, he complains, and, asking her at the same time what exactly has gone according to plan, she tells him that it was God, when he stopped time on Earth, and as a result, all beings on Earth were influenced by his powers, gaining resistance to his strength, which resulted in reactions that don't normally occur in dungeons. But the boy didn't want to listen and kept refusing. Furious, he tells him that, because he had developed all his skills over the last millennium, his forging abilities were divine, and years decides it's a good time to learn, and takes advantage of his remaining years to perfect his. Furthermore, the only person capable of building a dungeon on Earth was our protagonist, but the boy, despite, even after he had told him all that, he still refused. Elta tells him that if he does it, they would both win, saying, so, yes. They follow orders, and the boy would receive rewards for his efforts. The boy then asks him what would happen if he didn't do it, to which Elta replies that if that happens, the monsters would have nowhere to go, and humanity would suffer as a result. The protagonist has no choice but to accept the mission. Then, Elta tells him that he didn't need to worry about the plans and materials, since they would support him with everything he needed, and so he proceeds to show her how it contained a large quantity of magic stones, and they take advantage of this by not revealing their names, of some arcane stone, Pacina stone, and finally, a type of liquid called L. Alright everyone, I really don't know how to pronounce this word, but let's continue. Herka tells him that those 3 materials are used by higher beings, and in short, as it was implied, these elements are not movements, and, if you happen to be wondering how he would learn without a teacher on the ground, available on Earth. The boy, meanwhile, was distracted by an enormous magic stone, since he hadn't seen one that size before. Then, Berta shows him the materials the boy would be using, which excites him because before his very eyes, his eyes beheld the best tools. Likewise, he wondered if he was truly worthy to use them. Berta tells him that they are borrowed, and he would have to return them after completing the dungeon. This news saddens the boy, who says it was good while it lasted. Then, the protagonist asks her how he is supposed to create a dungeon with those objects, asking Berta if he isn't supposed to, digging in the ground or something, but she corrects him, clarifying that what he specifically needs to do is create magic tools to attract monsters, telling the boy that he needs to transform the surrounding area and convert it into a dungeon. And so, then, she gives him the blueprints so he can create the blueprints. Trap of Doom. And finally, she tells our protagonist that it won't be easy at all. And so, both he and Hila, what he expected was that, mysteriously, he couldn't find a single person on the way either. And since what was Earth, well, he had the internet, thanks to which he was able to learn the basics of some combat techniques. Decide to start creating the dungeon. Then we see that the Eternal Flame has a magic stone embedded within it. Apparently, our protagonist equipped it. Then it says that the Eternal Flame is likely too weak. He could add more stones to drastically increase the fire's intensity, and after placing one huge stone, we can see the flame's intensity drastically increase. Later, the protagonist was working on creating the dungeon, and as Elta watched him, he told himself he hoped he hadn't been wrong, wondering what would happen if Hila didn't change her class to Lancer since she had recommended it to him. Becoming a blacksmith, thinking that as a blacksmith, he might have been able to create weapons to challenge even the power of the gods. After this, we move on to the protagonist, who says that he now has a basic understanding of his goal, telling Erta that what he was doing made him nervous and that he didn't know if he would fail, but she tells him that if it fails and melts, he would just have to start over, but doing so was going to take a lot of time. And since he had plenty of time, perfecting it wasn't a problem at all. The angel even served as his training partner. The protagonist takes a deep breath and says, "Let's get to work." And as he worked once again, Erta was watching him from away, saying that she understands now. And as she looks at him, she tells herself that this must be how she must have felt. Obviously, she's talking about Lita. Ida wondered how a high-level angel like Lita had become interested in a human like him. Then, a loud sound interrupts Ida's thoughts. It was our protagonist, who wanted to tell her that he had finished everything already. She is impressed, since she didn't think that this would end that quickly. And suddenly, congratulations, you have awakened blacksmithing to the maximum level, and you have obtained the title Legend Creator. All production activities have become 20% more efficient. The angel couldn't believe it. Having completed in just 5 hours a process that typically takes several weeks. That was the result of 1,000 years of perfecting his blacksmithing skills. Furthermore, after impressing him, the girl noticed that the scale had no operational flaws, so she proceeded to call her comrades to begin the training, although as one would expect from an angel, he always ended up giving our protagonist a beating. Second part of the process. Unfortunately, the group of angels was not ready yet, so they quickly started their part, taking charge of providing some of their mana to poor Eli in order that he could give life to the dungeon, and to do so, he only had to imagine creating it. Even so, as soon as the process began, the protagonist was barely able to withstand such power, feeling like his body was being torn apart. But even so, he couldn't give up, which is why he continued with the creation of said dungeon, and after a few minutes the process ended, giving birth to a new monster trap. The angels couldn't believe it. They were completely shocked by Eli's willpower. This boy, because they thought it would take him at least 10 attempts to create that dungeon, but he accomplished it on his very first try. After completing the process, the protagonist and the angels took charge of positioning the dungeon in a good location. Naturally, as soon as they did this, the beasts that had awakened throughout the entire area immediately began to be drawn to the trap. And that's how the first dungeon was formed, trapping a large protagonist. Then time passes in the blink of an eye. Sure, for us, but not for the protagonist. Poor protagonist. Number of beasts inside. The protagonist was quite surprised. That was the power of the gods. They could control. Everything went as they wished, which motivated him even further to become much stronger. Strong enough that one day, he wouldn't have to. He could hear on the news reports about monsters all over the world, had begun to act strangely. The majority of them had started heading to specific locations. Of course, this was due to the appearance of the dungeon, as the angels had used Yila's dungeon to create copies, all over the world. Still, they needed the boy to create more dungeons, but for the moment, they had taken a break to take back all the magical power they had consumed. Meanwhile, the protagonist used his free time to continue with the creation of his armor, and for that, he used the skin of the wolves that he had defeated only a few days ago, managing to create good boots and very high-quality gloves. He obtained fierce wolf gloves. He obtained fierce wolf boots. He decided to finish the rest of the armor with the skin of the bear that he had defeated. Protagonist. We continued on, and just like that, the promised 10 years passed. the time for humanity's return had finally arrived. According to the day before, although the pieces took a little more work, even so, after a few days, he had obtained a armor of incredible quality. He's acquired bear hide armor and is even capable of withstanding the bite of a monster. But obviously, the banana wasn't satisfied with that and wanted to give it a personal touch, creating a sort of retractable spike covering the entire surface of the jacket. And, of course, he accomplished this using the leftover bones from the wolves, something that could assist him in emergency situations. Furthermore, with the few remaining bones, he managed to forge a knife to dismember the bodies of the monsters more efficiently, and even a kind of mask that was much more stylish than the previous one, resulting in the creation of the ultimate armor. Even so, while testing it out, the boy could hear the roar of a monster in the distance. Yesterday, the angel told him that it might be a monster that hadn't been caught by the dungeon yet, and if that were the case, it would be much more powerful than the previous ones he had encountered. And he was right, because when he arrived at the location where the protagonist was sufficiently prepared to live in the new world, so he decided to bid farewell to the noises were coming from. He realized that it was a kind of giant leopard, which was decimating the lives of the soldiers who remained to safeguard the land, as well as the lives of some civilians. Those who didn't want to travel to the other world were trying to contain the beast. Fortunately, the protagonist arrived into action and was eager to test out his new armor. And naturally, his entrance was at the perfect moment, as several military personnel were on the verge of death. This was after they failed in one of their attempts to attack. However, the protagonist once again utilized his stealth, combining it with his critical hit ability managed to destroy the creature's eye in a super epic scene. And he also used with the momentum of the attack, he had the speed to rescue the soldiers who had fallen victim to the leopard's onslaught. Still, the real battle had only just begun, because the leopard was now able to sense Eli's presence. Still, this was good news, since the civilians were. The protagonist promised that maybe one day they would see each other again. However, when the time for the humans to appear arrived, they used their mana to launch some attacks, but unfortunately, they didn't seem to hurt him much. Still, what injured him was the impact of a powerful electric shock to his eye, severely damaging it. If you're wondering who was responsible for that, well, it was none other than the Empress herself, who made an appearance this time. Even without his mask, and despite the attacks from everyone around him, the Leopard, or Leopard as you might know him, want to interpret it, remained focused on Eli, whom he ultimately charged at with a quite deranged manner. All the civilians, and even the Empress, couldn't believe it. Eli's life was in grave danger. Obviously, the protagonist had an ace up his sleeve, which turned out to be the thorns he had embedded in his suit. With those thorns, he was able to inflict significant damage on the creature, and after freeing himself, he unleashed a combo with all of his attacks, managing to land a barrage of critical hits, and that, combined with the damage that the civilians had caused to the creature's legs, was enough to bring it down. However, it wasn't over yet, because, absolutely nothing happened, and time continued to stand still. The protagonist, now angry, demanded an explanation, since, just as he was about to deliver the final blow, a kind of tentacle emerged from the creature. The angel warned the boy to get rid of it quickly, because the rank 3 creature was about to evolve, and if it caught up to them, everyone in that place would lose their lives, and even though Gila and the Empress landed attacks, they didn't seem to cause any damage. Fortunately, the Empress revealed to the protagonist that she knew how to use support magic, which could increase Eli's power. But after doing so, she wouldn't be able to use anything else for a long time. So, in the next move, she would not only entrust him with her power, but also her life. And of course, to activate her magic, she first needed to make contact with him. The protagonist, after she revealed how the spell worked, activated the buff. Immediately, all of his stats were suddenly increased. Still, the effect would only last for 3 minutes, so the protagonist had little time to finish off the beast. Furthermore, the Empress revealed that if they didn't finish with the beast, the government would send missiles to the location, so the protagonist wanted to avoid that at all costs. Launching his. No one showed up. Lita, who had returned to the protagonist's side, explained that perhaps the axis of time was best attack, the critical hit, which this time was charged with a powerful electric current. And thanks to that, he was able to defeat the mutated leopard. And after he did, the bus disappeared. Of course, the protagonist had managed to level up for free thanks to the experience gained from defeating the leopard. On the other hand, Ira had taken care of the threat, and the civilians in the area saw him as a hero. That guy had earned the respect of everyone. Although, of course, only for a brief moment, because after agreeing with the civilians on how to divide the cheetah's body, with 60% for the protagonist, 20% for the Empress, and 20% for the civilians, they did not agree that they would take the beast core as their 60% share, since they wanted that portion to be divided equally. But the fools didn't know who they were messing with, as the protagonist returned the core to the creature's body and warned them that if they didn't want him to take the beast core, he would take his 60% share. However, if it wasn't complete, he would end them all. In that place, obviously, upon hearing those terrifying words, the civilians agreed to let the boy keep the core. Diverted, so he just had to wait a few more years. Obviously, the protagonist did not agree with this, but he had core. Anyway, once he took his share, he decided to leave the place as always, without anyone noticing him. Even so, this time he was stopped by the Empress, who, by the way, the protagonist thought was very beautiful, and she proposed that the boy form a team, explaining that she wasn't interested in transmigrating to another world. She would stay on Earth, becoming much stronger, and she was sure he would do the same. However, seeing that the protagonist wasn't very convinced to accept her tempting offer, she ended up giving him her card so he could contact her when he needed help. He received it, obviously out of courtesy, but he wasn't very sure if he wanted to contact her in the future. After this, the protagonist returned to his workshop to continue creating the remaining dungeons, and after a few days, he managed to complete 5 more. Even so, the angel seemed very nervous, as she couldn't understand how it was possible that even rank 3 beasts were beginning to be born already, when that wasn't supposed to happen until several decades after a cataclysm, and she explained to the protagonist that perhaps it was because the beasts felt threatened. Happening was very strange. Our protagonist thinks that all of this is a dream, so he figures he just has to take another option. What he didn't expect was that the years kept passing, and humanity still hadn't returned. And so, 15 years passed by the recent dungeons and were trying to evolve rapidly in order to avoid being captured. This is because once the monsters are captured or locked inside one of these devices, their precarious lifestyle makes it very difficult for a creature to increase its rank. That's why they needed to hurry and finish off the remaining dungeons before the beasts continued to devour people. Fortunately, after a few days, the angels, their hand restored, returned to Earth and, with Eli's help, finished creating several additional dungeons, which would keep the beasts occupied for a few days. But setting that aside, on another note, the protagonist realized that, thanks to the recent level-ups, even his body seemed to have begun to develop in a better way, having gained considerably more muscle mass. But that wasn't all, because he had also awakened a new skill, the rest ability, which allowed him to recover lost energy in just a few hours. Furthermore, he could do it while sleeping, a pretty valuable ability that even the angel had. Years, 30 years, even 50 years passed, and humanity still hadn't returned. However, the protagonist, thanks to all been trying to awaken. Moreover, taking advantage of the moment, the angel explained things a little better to the protagonist, how the skills worked and how they, just like the monsters, could be leveled up in class. And, of course, to do that, certain requirements had to be met, such as the following. In order to advance to the 2nd class, your spear skill had to successfully kill a 3rd-class monster, and also obtain a magic stone of 3rd class, which was quite difficult for the boy at that moment. But setting that explanation aside, there was something that worried the angel, and that was the protagonist's lack of mana, especially since up until now he had been defeating the beasts with his martial arts and exceptional weapon forging skills. He was still worried that those capable of using mana would eventually surpass him, so to prevent that, he needed to continuously strengthen himself in every way. Of course, if he ever managed to use mana, he would become a terrifying being, even capable of dethroning the gods. But physical training was transforming into a human weapon. Yes, because of all the time he had spent. Well, leaving that aside, the next day, while Ira was listening to the news, he overheard how the civilians who had been dismembering the cheetah's carcass from the previous day had vanished without a trace. The protagonist couldn't explain what had happened to them until he concluded that perhaps another monster was at the scene, possibly because the leopard was about to give birth and may have even begun to evolve to protect her offspring, which, according to his deductions, was capable of using the same ability as the protagonist, the stealth with which it had been able to hide until the protagonist left, and after he, whatever it was, it had devoured the civilians, so the protagonist felt guilty about what happened. He was determined to put an end to that beast, and began preparing for the new confrontation, this time against someone who was also capable of using stealth. But that's all for today, folks. We're going to leave the recap here, since this manga is still releasing chapters. And if they release many more chapters, believe me, I'll be sure to bring them to you. So I'm counting on your like, and see you later. This has been Past. The boy began to grow more and more desperate. He couldn't even remember his mother's face anymore, which is why, to distract himself, he now not only trained his body, but decided to start reading all the books he found, and after reading all the books from his country, he began to learn other languages, then to travel all over the world, visiting several countries, and he continued reading every book he could find until, eventually, there were no books left to read. Even so, despite all the time that had passed, the protagonist continued to prepare for the cataclysm, even though nothing assured him that humanity would ever return. The angel began to worry that life might lose his sanity. Fortunately, the protagonist's mind was difficult to break, and no matter how many years passed, the difficult nap. But what he didn't expect was that upon arriving home, he couldn't find his parents anywhere either. And what's more, Boy continued to prepare for the cataclysm, so much so that after reading all the books in the world, he began to practice hunting and, of course, he wasn't allowed to marry the animals of the world, or the balance would be lost. Even so, he ended up perfecting his skills, even going so far as to hunt a sperm whale, the largest animal in existence, and after learning the art of hunting, he began practicing blacksmithing, spending decades learning to create all kinds of weapons, until, after 50 years, the boy was able to create a very powerful steel spear that, even according to the angel, could rival a weapon created by Mana. The angel grew more and more fond of the boy, who, this time, he earned her more respect by demonstrating all of his willpower, setting that aside after perfecting blacksmithing and hunting, the boy continued his training. The guy continued to progress relentlessly, without stopping, and according to the angel, he has experienced the evolution of man across several generations within a single body. Even so, 1,000 years had already passed since humanity disappeared, and the angel was becoming increasingly worried about the wasp. What's strange is when he notices that logo, realizing that time had completely stopped, because protagonist's sanity, so much so that she even began to consider the possibility of having a relationship with the boy. Previously, it was for professional purposes, as their mission was to care for the protagonist, which could fall within their duties. However, as she pondered this, her sword was drawn towards the sky, so Lita immediately went after it, but, as he did so, he realized that the day he had been waiting for so many years had finally arrived. However, regarding the angel, despite being happy for the boy, she was also saddened by the thought of never seeing the boy she had been with again. Lived together for more than 1,000 years, and they hadn't even been able to share a kiss. While, on the other hand, the protagonist, he was also saddened that he hadn't even had the chance to say goodbye to the person who had cared for him so much. She had cared for him for so long, and he hoped that one day they could meet again. After this, all of humanity returned to Earth, and the protagonist reappeared in the same place where time had stopped. Furthermore, a status window appeared before him, displaying, Liam, unemployed human, level 1, but not. Since he left the university, at least 2 hours should have passed, but time hadn't advanced even a second. Only he possessed one of these status windows, as the rest of humanity also had one. However, for them, there was only 10 years had passed since he was transported to the other world, not 1,000 like the protagonist. Furthermore, it seems that the progress that people had made in the other world had been reset, and now they had to start from zero back on Earth. Of course, at least they would have the basic knowledge of how to do things, something the protagonist lacked. Oh, by the way, remember the stealth skill that caused the protagonist to be forgotten? Well, now that was one of his main abilities, so very few people were able to notice his presence. It was as if the boy was invisible, although for now that didn't matter too much to the boy. He immediately returned home to reuniting with his mother, a mother whose face he didn't even remember anymore. That's really rough, not remembering his mother's face, but let's continue. Luckily, upon seeing her, all the affection he felt for her came rushing back. All his memories with her had returned. Finally, he was with his mother, and, of course, also with his father, since apparently he was still second, and not even the sun had moved. It's at that moment that he realizes time, back to normal, or well, almost back to normal. All this because his parents quickly started talking. What were they talking about? Part of the other world, they had been transported. The protagonist's father had been taken to a place called Aza, while the mother was taken to a place called Yami, along with all their neighbors. Unfortunately, neither of them had been able to learning how to control mana effectively, since it was apparently quite difficult. The protagonist, on the other hand, didn't even know how to join the conversation, since he didn't know anything about it. And of course, when they asked him where he had been taken, he didn't know how to respond, until he told them that he had been in a place with no name. After this, the mother asked the protagonist how he was progressing with managing mana, as she had heard that those who could control it well, could earn a lot of money by eliminating monsters. The father added that the people who learned to control mana were quite scarce, so he would definitely become very recognized. But unfortunately, the protagonist told them that he had not learned to master mana, which left quite a strain